Hello and welcome to the Bio360 podcast. And this is the second part of my interview with Dr. Thomas Cowen. And we're talking from the heart about the heart. Hello, Thomas.
Hi there. Tom.
Sorry, Tom.
Yeah, it's good.
I'm laughing because in all podcasts I heard with you, like all your like American fellows, they have like a hard time to say your surname. You know, I don't, but I fuck it up with your first name.
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay, so we have talked about the heart creating a vortex, and the vortex actually facilitates the organization of the stuff, so you call it, that is inside the blood, because the blood has to go, the red blood cells, they're actually thicker than the arteries. No, not the arteries. Sorry, the capillaries. It goes through. So there's a bit of a plumbing problem there, and so we want to have this red blood cells in the middle. But does that already explain the entire circulation, or is there anything more?
It only explains. That's the part of the circulation that the heart facilitates. It facilitates movement and it facilitates the organization. Mostly the organization of the blood. That's what the heart is doing. It holds back the blood so that it can be organized to serve life instead of being chaotic and anti-life.
Yeah, got that. So what does move the blood then?
Right. So now, again, the first thing to note is that when we say what moves the blood, we have to go to the place where the blood stopped, which is the capillaries. So what moves the blood in the capillaries? Now, in order to do that, I know you've got into this on previous podcasts, but so it turns out that in order to understand blood movement, you have to understand water. And even though one of the fundamental tenets of science is that matter only exists in three phases, the truth of the matter is water, and as far as I know, only water, has a fourth phase, which is not solid, liquid, or gas, but more like a gel, or some Jerry Pollack calls it exclusion zone. There's structured water. There's a whole lot of different names for it. And what he has been able to show is that if you put water in you fill up a tank with water, and then you put a hydrophilic tube, which means water-loving substance, and you roll that up into a tube, that there will be a very thin layer of this gel or exclusion or structured water lining the inside of the tube. That just happens because of the inherent, inevitable reaction of hydrophilic surfaces and water. Now, the interesting thing about this hydrophilic this exclusion zone gel-like layer lining the tube is it's always negatively charged, which means the positive charges that led to this being a negative charge, when the charges were separated, the positive charges got dissolved into the water part, or the liquid water, that's more in the center of the tube. So if your listeners can picture this, picture a tube in water that's lined with this very fine layer of negatively charged gel and positively charged charges in the liquid water in the center of the tube. Now, those positive charges will repel each other and cause the fluid, the water inside the tube, to flow. And you can prove this, and he has proven it. And so essentially you set up a perpetual motion device just because of the interaction of water and hydrophilic surfaces. So that in itself is startling, but he also found that it's not an energy-free system, that the energy for this system, for this separation of charges, generally speaking, comes either through the sun or the energy from the earth, or it could come from like human hands touching the beaker or the tube or the tank where the tube is in. Any of those will give the system enough energy to do this separation of charges. Now, if you apply that way of thinking to, say, the paradox in botany, which is we're told that fluids can only move up 33 feet high in a tree, that's so-called barometric limit, and the weight of the column of the fluid, in this case sap, will become so great after a 33-foot column that the sap won't be able to go up more than 33 feet. So that's the law. The trouble with the law is there's obviously trees that are 200, 300, 400 feet, and if there's no explanation of how they get up more than 33 feet, one could say, what's the deal? And the deal is that the tubes in a tree, so-called xylem tubes, are exactly hydrophilic tubes that have water inside them. They interact with the water to create this separation of charges. The positive charges repel each other. It can't go into the ground because that's like a barrier. So it has to go up. And as long as the tube is continuous, it can almost go up indefinitely, or at least 500 or 600 feet. So that's how fluid moves up in a tree. Now, nature, being conservative, uses the exact same method to make water move in a mammalian system. So again, you look at the part where we need the push, which is the capillaries. What are capillaries? They are hydrophilic tubes. What do they have in them? Water with stuff in it. So what's going to happen? They're going to form this negatively charged exclusion zone lining the capillaries, which by definition means there will be positive charges or protons dissolved in the blood, in the liquid part of the blood. And those positive charges will create an electrostatic repulsion, which then moves the blood up the venous tree because it can't go up the arterial tree because the blood is coming down the arteries. So it has to go the other way, which is up the veins, and then it coalesces into forming this from a watershed to a river, and that's what makes the blood move.
Yeah, amazing by itself.
Yeah, it's just very simple and very, very conservative. It's the same way blood moves or water moves in any other system. Nature didn't have to reinvent the wheel. I don't see why this is so hard to understand. You can prove it in a tube or in a tree or in a monkey.
Yeah, and we can observe it all everywhere in nature. You know, like you everywhere. Said, like in the trees. You know, there's. I mean, about water, there's like so many anomalies and so many phenomena that are known to any scientists also, but we kind of have our theories and we're not willing to even bend them. You know, we just say like, okay, there's like 50 exceptions to it, you know, but then nobody comes to the conclusion that maybe there is something wrong with the theory at all.
Exactly.
Maybe water has a different nature, and nobody talks about things like levitation and I mean, there's people start talking about this, you know, but the common sense is, we have H2O and that is it, you know, and there is so much more to water.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So, I'm wondering, if you take the heart out in a heart transplantation, and somebody gets a new heart, either mechanical or a heart from another human being. I heard you saying that there's actually then following a change in personality. Is that true? So
there's a researcher named Pearsall who's written a book called The Heart's Code, who I've communicated with about this. And interestingly, this doesn't happen with everybody, but it happens in enough people, in scores, hundreds of people, that he actually documented and wrote a book about it. And it's basically so so what happens is in certain people, and again, there's some interesting reasons why it happens for some and not others. But you take the heart out of somebody who's dying of whatever, congestive heart failure, and then somebody, for instance, who may have been shot in the head and they have a perfectly normal heart and it's blood-wise compatible, and then you put a transplant into the sick person, and then they do a lot better. Now, interestingly, some people, I would say, psychologically and emotionally sort of reject this new experience. And on the other hand, there's some people who are more open to it. So there's all kinds of amazing stories, like this guy who is a sort of what we call a sort of redneck racist person who gets the heart of a young black guy. So he's spent his whole life, denigrating people of other colors, not being interested in, any part of black culture. For whatever reason, after his heart transplant, he's suddenly interested in hanging out with his, the coworkers who are black people at work. He starts listening to classical music instead of his sort of more whatever country and Western, which makes no sense because, first of all, they didn't know who the heart donor was. And it goes on and on. So you get this whole new sort of emotional, psychological profile. And one of the most interesting things about that case in particular was that didn't make sense because you'd think young black man shot on the way to school. And now this guy, for the first time in his life, is listening to classical violin music. And so you can understand from a certain point of view, hanging out with black people and being interested in more black culture. And his movement goes from being sort of stiff and, old, sick, white person type movement to more fluid and more like young black men, not to be stereotypical, but they have better movement skills in general. Yeah. The thing that didn't make sense was, but black people, you would expect like hip hop music or something. How do you explain this classical violin? So it turns out the guy, he was not going to school. He was actually enrolled as a student in a music conservatory, and he was studying classical violin.
Amazing.
And there's, literally scores of stories like that. And so for those people who say, no, everything is just like Descartes, that's just a lump of tissue, there's nothing more to a human being or any living system. First of all, I don't know how you would explain this, because we associate the heart with love and now we're associating with the very essence of our personality, just like Steiner suggested. But I guarantee you, if you're a heart surgeon and you dissect somebody's heart, you will not find any part of it that's called personality. Like, oh, there's this group of heart cells. That must be the personality part. Or, no, I found this. Here's the love part right there. Now, interestingly, if you asked him, do you love your wife? He would probably say yes. So how much do you love your wife? Well, with all my heart. You say, are you sure? Not with all your spleen or with all your liver or with all your left testicle? No, I love her with all my heart. Okay, let's dissect your heart and find out where this love is, and it's not there. And yet he still believes, I'm being maybe stereotypical here because I don't know who this guy is or what he believes, but typically speaking, we believe there's nothing in a heart except the substance. Yet every human being has an inherent sense that that's, excuse my French here, that's nonsense.
Exactly. Yeah, everybody knows it. And I mean, we came a long way to live a life where we actually don't trust ourselves anymore. We don't trust our observations. We don't trust what we actually feel or know already in our heart, let's say. Because we have these expressions like everywhere. There's so many expressions that involve the heart. And so there is a deep and a strong knowledge about these things. But when it comes then to science or actually our understanding of the body, then we kind of discard that, and don't take it into account anymore.
Right. It's called cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
It's a very common way that people who want to manipulate other people use that strategy in order to confuse people into inaction. So everybody knows that there's this plane crash. And then they show you a picture of the plane crash area, and there's no bodies and there's no plane. And they say, but it must have been a plane crash because we told you it was a plane crash. And you look at it and you say, there's no plane, there's no people. You have the sense of everything inside you that says, I don't believe this. And yet you will be ostracized, humiliated, criticized, or whatever if you dare to dissent from the common understanding. And as some great philosopher said, just because tens of millions of people believe nonsense doesn't make it not nonsense.
Yeah. And there's so many things. We
live in a world of cognitive dissonance.
Yeah. There's so many things that are actually not correct or not true at all that pretty much everybody believes. But just the disconnection from what we really feel and what we know, that's kind of, I mean, I think that's probably something that maybe now, if not, then maybe never again, is coming up now. And people are connecting more to themselves and actually getting back into things like intuition and maybe to some of these qualities people like Goethe or Steiner have been actually in touch with, because they have had access to knowledge that most of us don't have. Certainly I don't.
Right, me neither. And I tell people all the time, your best friend is your own instincts and intuition about how you see the world. If you let that be co-opted, and the predominant way that it's co-opted today is the religion of science, which tells you all sorts of things that you should believe, but on closer examination turn out to be just complete and utter nonsense. And everybody knows it, but they're afraid to say it because nobody wants to be ostracized. Nobody wants to be the sore thumb who's saying something that nobody else is saying, because we're social creatures who fundamentally want to fit into our social environment. Who wants to be, the kook or the outsider? But because we're in a situation where the normal theories of, a lot of things are just ridiculous. Like the heart is a pump. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. Yeah, but such a man-made thing. And with man, I really mean man. I think women are a lot more in touch.
They're better.
Yeah, with some of these things we're talking about, but it just became the paradigm, and just like, I mean, you are going to be ridiculous if you really believe in these things, if you actually, take into account that there is something beyond that world that we can touch and measure. Talking about the blood again. There is a couple of things in the blood that make me wonder what they do. For example, we have iron in the blood. What does it actually do there?
I mean, so there's in a lot of things in life and in medicine and biology, there's many levels. So iron obviously is the base for hemoglobin, which is well suited to carry and offload oxygen. So that's one level. There's another level, which is everybody, of course, knows that iron is the primary and could be even the only magnetic element in the world. I'm not sure if that's true, but it's certainly the primary one, or the basis for magnetism. And the electromagnetic field that emanates around the heart essentially tells the other organs about the rhythmic entrainment. Now, that's a mouthful. So what do I mean by that?
It is.
So you have this iron, which is the magnetic element in nature, circulating in the blood. It comes to the heart. The heart creates this vortex out of this magnetic element, which then creates a torus-shaped magnetic field that one can actually map and measure, emanating around the heart, centering in the heart, that essentially influences the rhythmic functions of all the other organs. The way that I would picture that, the way I picture it to myself, is the heart is functioning like the conductor of an orchestra. Now, if you're going to play some orchestral piece, you have to have the oboes playing the oboe part and the violins playing the violin part, and et cetera, et cetera. You have to have each instrument doing its own function. Similarly, the liver does what livers do, the spleen does what spleens do, the muscles do what they do, the brain does what they do. But somehow they have to be integrated into a unified orchestra or organism in order to function harmoniously. Otherwise, we call it disease. So that function that's served by the composer in an orchestra is served by the heart, and the mechanism that it does that is by creating this torus-shaped electromagnetic field, which essentially sends out the rhythm of the heart to all the other organs so they can follow the rhythm of the heart and not their own intrinsic rhythm. Now, interestingly, when you have situations of heart failure and heart weakness, one of the typical other organs that takes on this composer-like function is the brain, because it has its own electromagnetic field. And if you end up having your brain be the organizer of your organs, you're in big trouble. Because the brain doesn't know how to do that right. It is a very, quote, selfish organ. And so the liver will do its own thing. And next thing you know, you have serious disease in the organs. So the definition of health is when the organs are, playing their proper oboe part, like a liver has to do what a liver does. And it's organized into the service of the whole. And that organization is carried out by the magnetic field based in the iron that's created by this vortex action of the heart.
Wow. Okay. So the iron is actually responsible for creating that electromagnetic field, which we can measure. I think from 10 or 12 meters. Still, there's a certain rooms where you can actually measure it from that far, and I think it's just the possibility of our equipment, So it basically the fields, the electromagnetic field of our heart is basically going into the universe, everywhere, We just can't measure it so sensible.
You can sense it though. That's what you sense when you fall in love. You sense the connection of the fields of the other person.
Yeah, and there's a lot of evidence or stories about a mother that feels that her child has a problem or gets sick on the other side of the world and stuff like that.
Yes.
Yeah. And so conducting is an interesting topic because there must be a lot of conducting in the body. Fritz Albert Pops showed us that we have like 100,000 chemical reactions in a cell per second, and not going there in a chaotic way. It's orchestrated. It's enchained. Things following each other. And there must be something or somebody who is actually orchestrating that on a cellular level. And then you were talking about organs. So, what is orchestrating the cells is already a very interesting question. How does that feel then? I try to wrap my mind around that. How does that electromagnetic field then actually orchestrate the organs? How is that physically working?
It works because all these chemical reactions and expressions of DNA and everything else biochemically that happens in the cells, in the tissues, is organized through water. The reason it's because water has an infinite number of binding sites and has the property of being able to make literally instantaneous phase shifts. So what I mean by phase shifts is if you can picture like a window blinder. So you have a window and then you have these blinders on it, and it has a mechanism that if you twist the mechanism, it goes from being open and letting the light in to shutting. And you don't have to close or open each individual shade. You just essentially touch the mechanism and it shifts phase and goes open or closed. So that's essentially what's happening, because the water in the cell, which is in this gel, which has, millions, infinite number of binding sites, therefore can do infinite number of chemical reactions depending on what phase it's in. The lever device, that's analogous to the lever that opens and closes the windows, is the electromagnetic influences on the water, as well as even chemical influences. There's infinite number of influences that determine the phase characteristics of the water, which then determines what chemical reactions are happening in the cells and tissues. That's how that works.
Oh, okay. I just can't wait to read your new book.
Because I would just finally say the water is organized itself. So Steiner used a word he called the etheric body, which is the water body. So the water itself is a separate, essentially non-physical organism that becomes, I would say, manifest in the physical gel-like water, and it's integrated across the entire human being, which is why things happen instantaneously in humans that couldn't possibly happen instantaneously outside of living systems. Like you think, move my foot, and instantaneously your foot moves. It doesn't even have any relation to time at all. And that can't happen in a non-living system. It's the difference between living and non-living systems.
Okay. Yeah. Really interesting stuff. We've been talking a little bit earlier about the brain and the heart and the magnetic fields, and the heart has a much stronger magnetic field, electromagnetic field, than the brain actually does. I heard you mentioned somewhere that the heart is associated with the sun and the brain is associated with the moon. Could you expand a little bit on that? And next question would be, is actually our brain in charge? Is that our problem today? And should we change that? And can we actually change it?
So the connection between the sun and gold and the heart is, these are old sort of initiatic alchemical, conceptions of the universe. Now, it's very hard to say prove that the heart is formed out of the forces that have created the sun. Like, one can't say follow the steps of that. One can say that when you look at, say, the number of breaths in a human being in a day, it turns out to be exactly the number of years that it takes the sun to traverse the zodiac, whatever that means, But so there's a lot of sort of cosmic connections between the heart and, solar-based phenomena. But apart from that, this is simply how the human being, the sort of initiatic stream or the esoteric stream of humanity, which basically includes all the important thinkers who we all know about, Shakespeare and Goethe and Newton and everybody, they were initiates fundamentally who believed in these alchemical principles of the connection between gold and sun and the heart. And now we think that's a bunch of nonsense because you can't, say, prove it in the usual way that we prove things. There are, of course, a lot of connections. And maybe somebody could prove it. Now, as far as the moon and the sun and the brain and silver, by the way, again, these are old-fashioned, alchemical, initiatic, mystical type of connections. Interestingly, when you condense silver into from molten to a sort of solid, it looks for all the world like the surface of the moon looks, which is curious. The moon controls the fluids in the world, controls the tides to a certain extent. It controls our internal fluids like menstrual cycles, etc. And the moon is about a reflection. The moon doesn't have its own light. The light that we see from the moon is all 100% reflected from the sun. And that's an interesting analogy between the brain doesn't create thoughts, no matter what your local neurologist or neurosurgeon or psychiatrist thinks. The brain is only the sort of storage or the reflector of thoughts. How I know that is complicated, and I don't think we can get into that right now. But that's the conception that we're working on. And as you say, one of our problems, and there's so many of our problems now that it takes too long to even mention the problems, let alone say why they're problems, is that we have our whole picture of nature and humanity is basically the computer, which is basically a brain. So we're head dominated. I wouldn't even say thinking dominated, because to me, the brain doesn't think, it reflects thoughts. Those are different.
Coming from where?
Where does the thoughts come from?
Yep.
Thoughts come from the wider universe. They're collected by the gel-like water in our tissues, in this case in our brain, which ends up in different phases, different configurations, of which water is incredibly sophisticated in changing its form and shape and structure depending on emotions, thoughts, etc. So the thoughts come from the outside. The brain collects them through the water living in the gel form in our nerve tissues.
Okay, we might start losing podcast listeners now, but I don't care, because it's really interesting. The thought I had, like maybe somebody like Steiner. I mean, if we're so focused on like our brain is actually an organ of thinking and of memory, which is proven to be not true. There's no memory in the brain. You need some sort of a brain to get access to the memories, but you can replace any part. You can cut out like half of it and you still get your memory back. So they haven't found any place in the brain where the memory sits. So
it's a storage device.
Yeah, exactly.
It's stored because of the infinite number of configurations that the watery gels align themselves in. It's as simple and straightforward as that.
Yeah, or some sort of antenna, maybe.
Yes. So if you have a properly functioning gel, it can accept, influences from outside. The analogy there, it's like having a radio. So you have this. It's saying that the brain thinks is like if you given a not to disparage Aboriginal people, but if you'd given an Aboriginal person a radio and said, where's the sound coming from? So obviously they'd look in the radio. And that's why people say, well, but I don't believe it if I can't see it. So, sorry. So it's like a radio. You can't see the transmission of the signal from the radio station or whatever it is, but you can prove that it's there because if you have a radio that's tuned properly, it will pick up that signal and somehow, which I don't understand how that happens, but transform it into sound that you hear. That's the definition of a healthy human being. You accept outside signals. They can be thoughts or emotions or concepts or hormones or toxins or anything. If your radio is tuned properly, and that's a complex acceptor device based on the watery gels, then you can transform that into things that you can action about, words that you can speak, concepts that you can deliver. And of course, all this happens out of time because life happens out of time, fundamentally.
No, if we look at our thoughts, they're not very productive. Usually, they're repetitive and very negative. Also, it seems like we're kind of trapped in our head a little bit, and maybe some things are getting in, but more than anything, it's like a rebouncing of thoughts that we already had. I wonder, like, if we let's blame Descartes for it. If we kind of came to a place where we so much concentrated on ourselves that we completely lost the connection to these spheres, let's say, where let's say you're right with what you're saying, that the thoughts are coming from outside, so we can't reach them anymore because we just don't even go there anymore, and maybe people like Steiner or Goethe, they actually went to directly to these places and so had access to knowledge that we certainly don't have.
Right. And the opposite is the stereotypical computer mogul. And all he knows is what's going around in his own, quote, computer. There's no wisdom, there's no knowledge, there's just data and information.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Let's make a little cut here, and in this moment, we get a little bit more to talk about this. We're going to talk about why the heart is an endocrine organ, and we talk about body temperature, and you touched on gold already a little bit. Thank you for being in this episode with me, and speak to you in the next and I think last part. Thank you.